All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the absolutely fascinating biological reality behind our split-second decisions. We hear a lot about trusting your gut or having a sixth sense when the pressure is on, but honestly, the truth is way more interesting than just folklore. Have you ever slammed on your car's brakes before you even consciously registered a hazard on the road? Or maybe you instantly knew a situation was dangerous before you could even put into words why. Well, the answer to how you did that isn't magic, and it's definitely not some psychic premonition. Instead, it's an incredibly fast, totally observable sequence of chemical reactions firing off right there in your brain. So if we look at the actual definition, intuition is the observable output of overlearned pattern recognition circuits interacting with your body's acute stress response. Now, what's really cool about this is it brilliantly shows us that your intuition is a measurable, evolutionary tool. It's pulling from stored emotional and procedural memories and putting them all together way, way faster than your conscious working memory ever could. It is literally built from the ground up to support those split-second survival decisions. So here's what we're going to cover in today's explainer. First, demystifying your gut feeling. Then, fast brain versus slow brain. We'll look at the two clocks of stress, dive into the chemistry of choice, explore the optimal stress zone, and finally, wrap up with training your intuition. All right, section 1, demystifying your gut feeling, specifically focusing on the somatic marker. A staggering 90%. That's right, 90% of your body's serotonin is produced down in your gut. So your gut feeling is a literal physical reality. It's not just a handy metaphor. And honestly, it makes total sense why stress always seems to go straight to our stomachs, right? Your enteric nervous system is constantly chatting with your brain through the vagus nerve. This ties perfectly into neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis. He basically showed that your body generates super rapid physiological signals, think changes in heart rate or your stomach doing flips, when you're anticipating an outcome. A part of your brain called the anterior insula reads those physical shifts as intuitive signals before you even have the chance to consciously reason through a choice. There's this famous Iowa gambling task where participants literally started sweating when reaching for a bad deck of cards, way before they consciously realized the deck was rigged. Your gut literally knows before your conscious mind does. So how on earth does the brain organize all this sudden, rapid-fire incoming data? Let's look at section 2, fast brain, slow brain, system 1 versus system 2. Daniel Kahneman's dual process theory is an absolute game changer here. Think of it like this. We have System 1, which is your incredible fast, automatic, emotion-heavy autopilot. This relies on deeper subcortical structures like the amygdala and the ventral striatum. Then we have System 2. That's your slow, deliberate, manual override driven by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Intuition? That is 100% a System 1 phenomenon. And here is the really wild part. Acute stress actively suppresses your deliberate System 2 override. It essentially forces your brain to trade deep deliberation for pure speed, completely favoring that rapid-fire, amygdala-driven System 1 autopilot. But how exactly does stress force that shift? That brings us to section 3, two clocks of stress, the SAM versus the HPA axis. When you encounter a sudden threat, you don't just have one alarm system going off. You actually have two parallel systems, and they're running on completely different timers. This timeline maps it out perfectly. Within literally seconds, the sympathetic adrenomedullary, or SAM axis, fires up. Your hypothalamus sends a rapid signal to the sympathetic nervous system, giving you that massive, immediate fight-or-flight rush. But then, operating on a much slower clock, taking anywhere from minutes to hours, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis, kicks into gear. This slower system releases cortisol, and that systematically shifts your decision control away from complex reasoning and heavily toward rigid, survival-based habits. Moving on to section 4, the chemistry of choice, where we meet the molecules of fast choice. First up on that incredibly fast SAM axis timer we're talking within mere seconds is adrenaline. Released by the adrenal medulla, adrenaline just completely floods your system to instantly spike your arousal levels. It abruptly narrows your attention. You totally stop noticing all the background noise around you, and you just lock straight onto the danger at hand. Right alongside adrenaline, we have noradrenaline. Firing centrally from the locus ceruleus, this chemical modulates your speed-accuracy trade-off. It's essentially asking your brain, do you need to act fast or do you need to be perfectly accurate? Crucially, it also supercharges emotional memory encoding via the amygdala and hippocampus. It is literally burning that high-stress moment into your mind like a flashbulb memory. Then, minutes later, cortisol arrives on the scene via that slower HPA axis. Cortisol literally rewires your brain circuits.
Now, in moderate amounts, it's great. It sharpens threat processing. But, as research by Schwab and Wolf has shown, excess cortisol actively impairs your prefrontal cortex, which is your rational brain. It physically forces your behavior away from careful, goal-directed planning and shifts it entirely toward rigid, habitual responses driven by the striatum.
Meanwhile, we have dopamine in the mix. Now, we usually just think of dopamine as the pleasure chemical, right? But under stress, mesolimbic dopamine acts more like a chemical compass. It encodes reward prediction and value, literally shaping which options actually feel attractive to you during a split-second rapid choice. Moderate stress-linked dopamine really enhances focus, but again, too much of it will degrade your complex judgment.
And finally, what goes up must come down. Enter the endocannabinoids. Acting as a totally crucial recovery mechanism, endocannabinoids bind to CB1 receptors to essentially act as the brakes for your brain. They cool down the amygdala's reactivity to help shut off that acute stress response, which allows your massive arousal to finally subside after the rapid decision has been made.
Let's zoom back out for Section 5, the optimal stress zone, looking at the Yerkes-Dodson curve. This curve is so fascinating because it perfectly maps out your brain's neurochemical Goldilocks zone. See, you actually need just the right amount of catecholamines and cortisol to achieve expert-level intuition. If there's too little stress, you're unfocused and apathetic. But if there's too much stress, like when you cross right over the peak of that curve, your prefrontal cortex connectivity degrades. Your complex reasoning just completely shuts down, and your decisions devolve into rigid and sometimes even panicked habits. Think about experts who perform flawlessly under immense pressure. Surgeons, pilots, elite athletes. They aren't completely devoid of stress. They are just operating right there at the peak of this curve. Which, of course, begs the big question, how can you train yourself to do the exact same thing? That leads us to our final section, number 6, training your intuition by optimizing your neurochemistry. The good news here is that you absolutely do not have to be a victim of your own biology. You can actively train your chemistry to stay within that optimal performance zone. How? Well, first, through deliberate practice. Getting repeated exposure to specific scenarios physically strengthens your brain's pattern libraries, which lets you bypass that slow System 2 processing entirely. Second, there's stress inoculation training. This is basically graded exposure to controlled stressors. It's heavily used in military and medical training, and it actively recalibrates your HPA axis reactivity over time. Third, heart rate variability or HRV biofeedback. When you pair this with slow breathing, it enhances your parasympathetic vagal tone, actively putting a damper on excessive sympathetic arousal. And finally, mindfulness and interoceptive awareness training. This actually alters the activity in your insula, helping you get way better at discriminating between a true informative gut feeling and just everyday nervous background noise. So, if there is one absolutely crucial point I want you to take away from this explainer, it's this. Your intuition is not magic. It is a highly measurable biological process. It's a beautifully evolved symphony of pattern recognition, rapid neurochemical release, and physiological feedback. Understanding the science behind this is fundamentally empowering. You aren't just taking a wild guess when you feel a gut instinct. Your brain and body are crunching massive amounts of data at lightning speed. I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Knowing exactly how stress chemistry can either hyperfocus or completely hijack your brain, what steps are you going to take to train your intuition for your very next split-second decision? Because whether it's practicing HRV breathing or building up those pattern libraries through deliberate practice, you possess the immense power to optimize your own neurochemistry. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and remember to keep trusting and training your gut.